He built a company with his own two hands, gave his best friend half of everything he owned, and never once thought to check the numbers. 22 years later, that same friend stood in a courtroom and pointed a finger at him, calling him a thief. By the time the truth came out, the company was gone, the marriage was nearly gone, and the man who trusted too much had lost almost everything a person can lose without losing his own name. This is the story of Daniel Voss, the friend who destroyed him, and the one piece of evidence nobody saw coming until it was almost too late. Before we go further, 3 questions are going to sit with you for the next hour, and you should keep them in the back of your mind as the story unfolds. Who really controlled the money at Voss and Reed Freight, and how long had they been hiding it? Why did a company that looked healthy on paper collapse overnight the moment federal auditors walked through the door? And who, in the final weeks of the trial, handed investigators the one document that changed everything? A person nobody in that courtroom expected to turn against the family they loved. Keep those questions close. The answers are not what you think. Daniel Voss grew up in a small town outside Toledo, Ohio, the son of a long-haul truck driver who was gone 4 nights out of 7. He learned early that a man's word was worth more than his paycheck, because his father's word was the only currency the family ever seemed to have plenty of. Daniel met Marcus Reed in the 10th grade, 2 boys sitting in the back of a shop class neither of them wanted to be in, bonding over a shared hatred of their algebra teacher and a shared dream of never working for anyone else as long as they lived. They were inseparable by graduation. Where Daniel was patient and careful, Marcus was quick, charming, the kind of person who could talk his way into a locked building and out of a parking ticket in the same afternoon. People who knew them both used to joke that Daniel built the roads and Marcus sold the tickets to travel on them. At 24, Daniel bought his first truck with a loan his father co-signed against the family's small piece of land, a decision that terrified his mother and that his father defended until the day he died. Marcus came along for the ride almost by accident, helping with paperwork one weekend that turned into managing the books full-time within a year. By the time they were 30, Voss and Reed Freight had 6 trucks, a small warehouse outside Columbus, and a reputation for showing up on time when nobody else could. Daniel handled the routes, the drivers, the handshake deals with local manufacturers who needed a partner they could trust. Marcus handled everything with a decimal point in front of it, and Daniel never once asked to see the ledgers because why would he? Marcus was the brother he never had. Daniel married Elena in his early 30s, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman who worked as a high school guidance counselor and who had a habit of noticing things other people missed. She liked Marcus well enough at first, the way you like a loud uncle at a holiday dinner, entertaining from a distance but never someone you'd hand your car keys to. Over the years that feeling hardened into something closer to caution, though she rarely said so out loud, not wanting to plant doubt in a friendship that had survived 20 years already. She noticed the new truck Marcus drove every 18 months while Daniel drove the same pickup for a decade. She noticed the vacations, the boat, the second house near the lake that Marcus always explained away with talk of smart investments and lucky timing. Daniel noticed too in the quiet moments, but he pushed the thought down every time because doubting Marcus felt like doubting the ground he stood on. The company grew past anything either of them had imagined as teenagers in that shop class. By their late 40s, Voss and Reed Freight ran 90 trucks across 4 states, employed over 200 people, and had become the kind of local success story that got written up in regional business magazines with a photo of the 2 men standing in front of the warehouse, arms crossed, grinning like the boys they used to be. Daniel's son Caleb grew up around the trucks, learned to change a tire before he learned to drive a car, and eventually took a job in operations after college, determined to earn his place rather than simply inherit it. Marcus never had children of his own, a fact he mentioned less and less as the years went on, though those close to him noticed he'd started spending long stretches of time with a woman named Renata, someone Daniel had met only twice and knew almost nothing about. Underneath the success, small things had started to shift years before anyone else could see them. Marcus had quietly restructured how vendor payments moved through the company, routing an increasing share of transactions through a handful of shell entities he controlled personally, entities with names generic enough to blend into any invoice a person skimmed rather than read. He told himself it was temporary, a bridge to cover a gambling debt from a poker game in Cincinnati that had gone catastrophically wrong one weekend nobody else at the company knew about. One bridge became 3. 3 became a permanent structure he built in the dark, brick by brick, While his best friend signed off on financial summaries Marcus prepared for him, trusting the man who had never once, in 20 years, given him a reason not to. The first crack in the foundation appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, when a routine compliance letter arrived from the state's Department of Revenue, flagging inconsistencies in 3 years of filed tax documents. Daniel barely glanced at it, assumed it was the kind of bureaucratic noise that showed up twice a year and always resolved itself with a phone call from the accounting department. He handed it to Marcus without a second thought, the way he'd handed him 1,000 documents before, and Marcus assured him it was nothing, a clerical mismatch already being handled. What Daniel didn't see was the look that crossed Marcus's face the moment he was alone in his office, the color leaving it. His hands trembling as he read the letter a second time and understood, for the first time in years, that the structure he'd built might not hold much longer. Within 6 weeks, the state auditors had escalated their inquiry to a formal investigation, and federal agents from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division joined shortly after. A detail that should have terrified everyone in that building, but that Daniel, still trusting the story he'd been told, treated as an inconvenience rather than a warning. He remembers the exact moment the tone changed. A Thursday afternoon when 2 agents walked into the warehouse office not to ask questions, but to serve a search warrant. Boxes of documents leaving the building on hand trucks while employees stood in the parking lot watching in silence. Daniel called Marcus 4 times that afternoon. Marcus didn't answer once. And that is when the first real crack in 22 years of friendship opened wide enough for Daniel to finally look through it and see something he did not recognize on the other side. 3 weeks later, Daniel was arrested at his own front door at 6 in the morning, in front of Elena, in front of the neighbors already out watering their lawns, in handcuffs for crimes he did not know had been committed. The charges named him as the architect of a multi-year fraud scheme involving falsified invoices, diverted client payments, and a network of shell companies used to launder company funds. Every document the prosecution presented bore Daniel's signature, some of them genuine signatures on documents he trusted Marcus to prepare accurately, others forged so precisely that even Daniel, staring at his own name, wasn't entirely sure at first whether he'd signed them himself in some meeting he no longer remembered. Marcus, meanwhile, sat in a separate room down the hall from investigators, calm, cooperative, and utterly convincing as he described a business partner who had, in his telling, grown reckless and greedy in his final years running the company. The story broke across local news within days, then spread to national business outlets hungry for a clean narrative about a trusted local employer secretly bleeding his own workers dry. Reporters camped outside the Voss family home. Old photographs of Daniel and Marcus standing arm in arm in front of the warehouse resurfaced online, captioned now with words like disgraced and exposed. Employees who had worked for the company for 15 years, people whose children Daniel had personally hired for summer jobs, found themselves giving interviews expressing shock and betrayal, their loyalty splitting cleanly along the line the media had already drawn for them. Elena stopped answering the phone entirely after the 40th call from a stranger asking how it felt to be married to a man capable of something like this. Caleb, 26 years old and working in operations at the very company under investigation, watched his father's name become a punchline in comment sections he made the mistake of reading late at night. What almost nobody outside the family understood was how completely Daniel refused, even then, to believe that Marcus had done this on purpose. He told his lawyer, a sharp, patient woman named Priya Anand, that there had to be an explanation, that someone else at the company must have used Marcus's access, that his friend of 22 years could not possibly have built an entire criminal operation under his nose and let him take the fall for it. Priya listened to this theory more than once in their early meetings, and each time she gently reminded him that the prosecution's case rested almost entirely on documents Marcus himself had prepared, presented, and now testified against him with. Daniel would go quiet after these conversations, staring out the window of her office for long stretches, unwilling yet to accept what the evidence was already screaming at him. The investigation that followed was less about proving Daniel's innocence, which felt at times like an uphill argument against a mountain of paperwork stacked expertly against him, and more about finding the one thread that, if pulled hard enough, would unravel the entire structure Marcus had spent years reinforcing. Priya brought in a forensic accountant named Owen Marsh, a quiet, methodical man who had spent 15 years untangling exactly this kind of fraud for defense attorneys across the Midwest. Owen didn't start with the documents the prosecution had already flagged. He started earlier, pulling banking records from a decade back, looking for the origin point of the shell companies rather than their most recent activity, working on the theory that every fraud this elaborate begins with a single mistake made by someone who, at the time, never expected anyone to look that far back. For weeks, the investigation produced nothing but dead ends and false leads that ate up time the defense could not afford to waste. One early theory suggested that a former bookkeeper, fired years earlier under contentious circumstances, might have set up the shell companies out of resentment before leaving the company entirely. That theory collapsed once bank records showed activity on the accounts well after the bookkeeper had moved out of state and taken an unrelated job. Another theory pointed toward Renata, the woman Marcus had been quietly involved with for years, suggesting she might be the true architect behind the scheme, using Marcus as an unwitting front. That theory also collapsed slowly and painfully once investigators confirmed Renata had no access to the company's systems and had, in fact, grown increasingly distant from Marcus in the final year before his arrest, for reasons nobody outside their relationship fully understood at the time. It was Owen who finally found the thread, buried in a decade-old wire transfer so small it had never been flagged by anyone. A $4,000 payment routed from an early Voss and Reed account to a shell entity registered under a name that traced back, after weeks of careful work, to a poker room in Cincinnati that had closed its doors years earlier following a string of unrelated legal troubles. That single transfer connected Marcus, personally, to the very first shell company in the chain, years before Daniel had ever been forged onto a single document. It was the origin point Owen had been searching for, proof that the structure hadn't begun with Daniel's greed at all, but with a gambling debt Marcus had never told a single person about, not Renata, not his lawyer, and certainly not the best friend whose name he would later use to bury it. Armed with that thread, Priya and Owen spent the next several weeks pulling on it carefully, aware that a single misstep could give Marcus's legal team time to bury the evidence deeper or destroy what remained of it entirely. They traced the shell company's ownership history through 3 separate registered agents before finding the filing that connected it directly to Marcus's personal signature, a document he had clearly believed no one would ever think to request, buried in a state registry that hadn't been updated online and had to be physically retrieved from an archive 2 hours outside Columbus. Owen drove there himself on a Saturday, waited 4 hours for a records clerk to locate the file, and called Priya from the parking lot the moment he had it in hand, his voice, by her account, shaking with an excitement he rarely allowed himself in a job built on patience. The document alone might not have been enough to overturn a case the prosecution had already built with such confidence, and Priya knew it. What they needed was someone inside the company willing to testify to what they had personally witnessed, someone with access to the internal systems who could speak to patterns investigators outside the company could only infer from paperwork. That person, when they finally found the courage to come forward, turned out to be someone nobody in the family had considered even for a moment, someone whose loyalty everyone had simply assumed belonged entirely to Marcus, because for years it clearly had. Her name was Danica Reyes, a junior accountant who had joined the company 3 years earlier and worked directly under Marcus, handling much of the day-to-day bookkeeping he no longer had time for as the shell structure grew more complicated to maintain alone. She had noticed inconsistencies almost a year before Daniel's arrest, small ones at first, numbers that didn't reconcile cleanly at the end of a quarter, vendor names she didn't recognize attached to invoices Marcus always personally approved before she could ask questions about them. She'd raised a concern once, quietly, in her second year, and Marcus had responded with such warmth and reassurance, framing it as a legacy accounting quirk from the company's early years, that she'd let the matter drop, telling herself she was simply too new to understand the full picture yet. What finally changed Danica's mind wasn't a single document or a single conversation, but the sight of Daniel Voss's face on the local news the morning after his arrest. A man she had met perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, always warm, always asking about her family by name, standing in handcuffs on his own front lawn while reporters shouted questions at him. She told investigators later that something about that image sat wrong with her for days, a feeling she couldn't shake no matter how many times Marcus reassured the remaining staff that the investigation would clear itself up soon. She began, quietly and carefully, pulling her own copies of records she had legitimate access to, not to build a case, she insisted, but simply to understand for herself what had actually happened inside a company she had trusted enough to build a career in. It took Danica nearly 2 months to work up the courage to contact Priya's office directly. 2 months during which she continued showing up to work every day beside the man she now suspected of orchestrating an elaborate fraud and letting his oldest friend take the blame for it. She described that period later as the hardest of her professional life, smiling at Marcus across the office each morning while carrying, in a locked drawer at home, printed copies of internal transaction logs that told a very different story than the one he'd been telling everyone else. When she finally called Priya's office, she didn't ask for protection or immunity first, the way most people in her position might have. She simply said she had documents that proved Daniel Voss hadn't built the shell company structure, and she wanted someone to actually look at them. The documents Danica brought forward didn't just support Owen's earlier findings about the Cincinnati wire transfer. They extended the timeline forward, showing internal system logs with timestamps and login credentials that placed Marcus, and only Marcus, inside the software used to generate the falsified vendor invoices during the exact windows those invoices were created. Daniel's login credentials appeared nowhere near those timestamps, a detail the original investigation had somehow overlooked entirely, perhaps because nobody had thought to ask the question in the first place once Marcus had positioned himself so effectively as the loyal witness rather than the primary suspect. Priya remembers reading through the logs late into the night, realizing that the case against Daniel, which had felt for months like an unmovable wall, finally had a door in it. The revised defense strategy came together quickly once the new evidence was in hand, built around a single, carefully sequenced presentation designed to walk the jury through exactly what investigators had missed the first time. Priya opened not with an accusation against Marcus, which she knew risked sounding like desperation from a cornered defense, but with a simple, quiet question posed directly to the jury. If Daniel Voss built this entire structure himself, why does every technical trace of its creation point to someone else's fingerprints? She let that question sit in the room for a long moment before calling Owen Marsh to the stand. Then Danica Reyes after him, each witness adding another layer to a picture the prosecution had never expected the defense to be able to draw. Marcus's composure, which had held remarkably steady through months of proceedings, began to visibly crack during cross-examination, when Priya walked him, document by document, through the Cincinnati wire transfer, the registered agent filings bearing his personal signature, and finally the system logs Danica had preserved. He tried, at first, to explain each piece away individually, the way he had explained away every small inconsistency for years, but the explanations grew thinner and more contradictory with each new document, until even his own legal team's expressions in the courtroom shifted from confidence to something closer to concern. Daniel sat perfectly still throughout this testimony, Elena's hand gripping his under the defense table, watching the man he had called his brother for 22 years finally run out of road. The final piece, the one nobody in that courtroom saw coming until the very last week of trial, arrived not from Priya's team but from an unexpected witness the prosecution itself had planned to call in Marcus's defense. His name was Julian Reed, Marcus's estranged nephew, a young man in his late 20s who had spent a brief period working in the company's IT department years earlier before a falling out with his uncle had pushed him out of the family entirely. Julian had followed the case in the news like everyone else, and something about the technical details being reported, the shell companies, the login timestamps, matched a memory he'd been carrying quietly for years, a memory of helping his uncle set up a private server outside the company's official network during his brief employment, a server he'd never fully understood the purpose of until now. Julian reached out to Priya's office directly, unprompted, in the final weeks before closing arguments, offering testimony about that private server and the offshore backup account he'd unknowingly helped configure years earlier, a system that, once properly examined by Owen's team, turned out to contain years of original, unaltered financial records Marcus had believed permanently deleted. Those records didn't just confirm what Danica's logs had already shown. They extended the fraud's timeline back further than anyone had realized, revealing that Marcus's gambling debt had been only the first of several personal financial crises he'd used company funds to quietly resolve over the years, each one adding another layer of falsified documentation to a structure that had, by the end, grown far larger and far older than even Daniel's defense team had initially understood. The trial's final week unfolded with a kind of quiet gravity that the earlier, more sensational months had lacked, the courtroom's attention shifting entirely from Daniel, who sat largely silent throughout, to Marcus, whose testimony under cross-examination grew increasingly fragmented as prosecutors, now working alongside the defense's evidence rather than against it, pressed him on inconsistencies he could no longer smooth over with charm alone. When the jury returned after less than 6 hours of deliberation, the courtroom was fuller than it had been at any point during the trial, word having spread through the small legal community that something extraordinary had happened in that room over the preceding 2 weeks. Daniel Voss was acquitted on every charge. Marcus Reed was formally indicted the same afternoon on charges that would eventually include wire fraud, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice, charges that carried, prosecutors noted afterward, a significantly longer potential sentence than the ones Daniel had originally faced. The moment the verdict was read, Daniel didn't smile the way people expected him to in the years they'd spend replaying that day. Elena said later that he simply closed his eyes, exhaled once, long and slow, and reached for Caleb's hand across the row behind him. The two of them holding on for a long moment while the courtroom around them erupted into the kind of noise a room makes when a story everyone thought they understood turns out to have been wrong the entire time. Marcus, seated at the defense table 20 feet away, did not look at Daniel once. His eyes fixed instead on the table in front of him. The charm that had carried him through 22 years of friendship and 8 months of testimony finally, visibly gone. In the months that followed, Daniel faced a different kind of reckoning than the one the courtroom had prepared him for, the slow, uneven process of rebuilding a life that had been publicly dismantled piece by piece over the better part of a year. The company itself, battered by the scandal and the loss of dozens of contracts during the investigation, survived only barely, kept afloat largely by Caleb, who had quietly taken on more operational responsibility during his father's absence than anyone had realized at the time. Learning under pressure the parts of the business Marcus had always kept carefully hidden from both of them. Employees who had given those early, damning interviews began, slowly, to reach out again, some with apologies, some simply asking to come back to work, and Daniel, to the surprise of more than a few of them, said yes more often than not, because he understood now, in a way he hadn't before, how easily a convincing story could reshape what people believed they'd seen with their own eyes. Danica Reyes stayed with the company after the trial, promoted eventually into a senior finance role Daniel created specifically for her, a decision he described later as the easiest one he made that entire year. Julian Reed, whose testimony had turned out to be the case's final, decisive piece, remained more distant, uncomfortable with the attention his role had drawn and unwilling, even months later, to fully reconcile with the family his uncle's actions had torn apart, though he and Caleb began, slowly, exchanging the occasional message, two young men trying to understand what they owed each other, if anything, after everything that had happened. Elena went back to her work at the high school within weeks of the verdict, though she has said in the years since that she still, occasionally, finds herself double-checking documents she has no real reason to distrust, a habit the entire experience left her unable to fully shake. Marcus Reed was sentenced 14 months later to 11 years in federal prison, a sentence he received without visible reaction, according to those in the courtroom that day, the same composure that had once made him so effective now reading, to everyone watching, as something closer to emptiness. He has not spoken publicly about the case since sentencing, and Daniel, when asked directly by more than one reporter over the following year whether he has ever considered visiting his former partner in prison, has given some version of the same answer each time. He says he has thought about it more than people might expect, not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of a need to understand something he still cannot fully explain to himself, how a friendship built over 22 years, tested through every ordinary hardship 2 lives can produce, could hold so much weight for so long and still, in the end, mean so little to the one person who was supposed to protect it most. What this story leaves behind, more than the verdict or the sentence or even the company's slow recovery, is a harder question that doesn't resolve as cleanly as a courtroom does. Trust, the kind built over decades rather than months, is not something most people think to audit, because the entire premise of trust is that auditing shouldn't be necessary. Daniel Voss gave his best friend the one thing he never gave anyone else, complete and unquestioned access, and it took a junior accountant's quiet conscience, a forensic accountant's stubborn patience, and an estranged nephew's unexpected memory to finally prove what should never have needed proving in the first place. Would you have caught it sooner? Would the years of comfort and history have blinded you the same way? That question doesn't have a clean answer, and maybe it isn't supposed to. If the story stayed with you, we have another one waiting, a case involving a family inheritance, a missing will, and a secret that stayed buried for almost 30 years before one overlooked signature brought the entire thing back into the light. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.